Hey guys, tonight we're kicking things off with a hunk of iron. Talk about an unsung hero of human history, from the swords of knights to towering cathedrals, from humble plows to the imposing bars of prisons. Iron was the backbone of the medieval world, and somehow it's still outlasting your darn lawnmower. So, before you get too cozy, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you're genuinely enjoying the content I'm putting out here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see who's joining the party from all corners of the globe. Now, let's dim those lights a bit, maybe turn on a fan for that nice, subtle background noise, and let's settle in together for tonight's adventure. If you ever find yourself wandering through a medieval cathedral, take a real good look at the ironwork, the bolts, the hinges, the gates, and the railings. They've been sitting there since the Crusades, holding their own against the rain, the plague, countless drips of candle wax, and every tourist who's touched them for good luck. They're dark, they're sturdy, and they're just sitting there smugly intact. Meanwhile, your patio furniture is decomposing faster than a forgotten piece of fruit because it got rained on twice. The Middle Ages get a bad rap for ignorance, filth, and some seriously questionable medical ideas involving leeches. But when it came to metal, those guys accidentally stumbled onto the secret of immortality. Medieval blacksmiths weren't scientists. They had fire, intuition, and forearms that could probably shred cheese. Their furnaces, which they called bloomeries, were basically little clay ovens that ran on charcoal and pure spite. They couldn't reach the temperatures needed to completely melt iron, which sounds like a major design flaw, but somehow it wasn't. There's a very good reason we still stumble across intact medieval gates, tools, and swords that are 8 centuries old, while your so-called stainless steel appliances are already shedding flakes like a dandruff commercial after only 5 years in your kitchen. We traded patience for a dazzling shine, endurance for cutthroat efficiency, and rugged individuality for bland conformity. The blacksmith's forge was never about chasing some unattainable ideal of perfection. It was about gritty, stubborn survival. His mission wasn't to churn out flawless metal, it was to forge forgiving metal, something that could bend, get scarred, and still keep on ticking. The 20th century bestowed upon us many wonders. Flight, electricity, and the uncanny ability to take perfectly good metal and ruin it with slick marketing campaigns. Cue stainless steel, the material that promised us eternal life and delivered, well, disappointment. We were told it would never rust, never stain, never fail. And just like every other promise that sounds too good to be true, it came with a microscopic asterisk. Asterisk unless exposed to oxygen, water, or the relentless march of time. Stainless sounds so permanent, so invincible, like something Zeus himself would probably use for his silverware. In reality, it's a fragile diva with a full-blown meltdown waiting to happen. Sure, it can fend off rust in a sterile laboratory environment, but in your backyard, where humidity and pollution are constantly playing tag, it doesn't stand a snowball's chance in you-know-where. That refrigerator handle or that shiny garden trowel. Give them 2 years, and they'll look like they're auditioning for a historical reenactment of the Titanic. The big secret behind stainless steel lies in an incredibly thin, virtually invisible layer of chromium oxide that forms on the surface, a passive film that's supposed to stop rust in its tracks. It's undeniably clever, but it's also incredibly clingy. Rat catchers thrived on fear, pure and simple. The more the city panicked and descended into chaos, the more their trade boomed. But unbridled greed always seemed to follow close behind. The very same people who had been desperately begging for his help at the height of the infection would invariably try to haggle the agreed-upon price down to practically nothing once the overpowering stench of death began to fade from the streets. If the rat catcher dared to complain about this blatant hypocrisy, they'd often accuse him of spreading the disease himself, branding him as a walking curse, bringing vermin along with him wherever he happened to go. More than one unlucky catcher was violently beaten or summarily chased out of town altogether when the rats inevitably returned in even greater numbers. Still, the grim job never completely disappeared. The burgeoning cities desperately needed him, no matter how vehemently they denied it. The rats were relentless, constant, practically eternal, gnawing their way through precious grain stores, burrowing into the sacred walls of monasteries, and even daring to nest beneath the very floorboards of the wealthy and privileged. And so the rat catcher perpetually returned, night after night, wearily working for mere coppers and meager crumbs in a squalid marketplace that perpetually reeked of ingrained filth, pervasive fear, and blatant human hypocrisy, where the impoverished man who diligently saved countless lives couldn't even manage to save his own. Every seasoned medieval rat catcher understood one fundamental truth. He was never truly in control of the situation. The rats were clever, far too clever, in fact. They learned quickly, studiously avoided carelessly placed traps, and bred at an alarming rate, outpacing any man's ability to kill them off. A single female rat could produce dozens of offspring in a single month, and within a matter of weeks, an entirely new swarm would rise up to replace the old one. He'd been spat at just a week prior, but fame in his world was more of a curse than a blessing. The second things calmed down, he was once again forgotten, a necessary evil put away and ignored until the next emergency arose. And so, he wandered from town to town, nameless, without friends, yet utterly indispensable. The rat catcher had no fixed address, no home to speak of, and no legacy to leave behind. He was the city's shadow, tolerated only as long as the scratching noises in the dark didn't cease. For a population governed by faith and fear, the rat catcher existed on the fringes of both. His profession was part skill, part curse, a bizarre dance with the creatures that everyone loathed. In medieval times, people didn't just see rats as pesky rodents. They were symbols of sin, excessive greed, and the devil's foul deeds. To catch them was to wage war against evil itself, but to live amongst them, that was a completely different story. Villagers would whisper that rat catchers were in league with demons. How else could a single person control such a massive outbreak of creatures? Some claimed they made deals with dark entities, trading their souls for control over the vermin. Others thought they carried amulets fashioned from rat tails or bones, soaked in blood and blessed under the pale light of the new moon. A few even sported necklaces made with the teeth of their prey, claiming it warded off disease. It rarely worked. Church records from both England and Germany mention rat catchers being accused of witchcraft. Their smoke pots, filled with sulfur and strange herbs, looked awfully similar to bubbling cauldrons. Their mumbled curses sounded like wicked incantations. And whenever plague returned after a cleansing, villagers would turn on them, yelling that the catchers had summoned the rats back to punish the ungrateful. Some were forced to flee town, never to return. Others simply disappeared into the woods, never seen again. Memory lingered. Officials painstakingly counted the dead, and quickly drafted new fire ordinances, promising yet again that such a tragedy would never be repeated. But it always was. The fire watcher often made his way back to his tower as the sun began to set. Repairs commenced down below, but his duty resumed immediately because embers still glowed ominously under the scorched beams, and the wind still carried the telltale scent of danger. He would climb once more, each step an aching reminder, to the very same perch where he had helplessly watched the city burn. From that vantage point, he would see smoke still lazily rising in thin, ghostly trails, and perhaps for a fleeting moment, he would be haunted by the chilling belief that it was all starting over again. But as the sun fully dipped below the horizon, the rooftops would turn to gold once more, bathed in the warm, forgiving light. Children would tentatively emerge and begin to play amid the ruins. The city's vital pulse would gradually begin to return, and high above, the fire watcher would stand silently against the fading light, his bell at rest, his eyes tired but unblinking. He knew deep down that peace was merely an illusion, a fragile reprieve granted by mercy, not mastery. For the medieval city was like a flickering candle in the vast darkness, and he was its trembling flame, flickering, ever vigilant, and forever just one errant breath away from being snuffed out entirely. By day, Dodge City appeared to be just another ordinary frontier settlement. You'd see dusty streets, rough-hewn clapboard saloons, horses tied haphazardly to the hitching rails, and a courthouse trying its very best to project an air of respectability. But as soon as the sun began to sink below the seemingly endless Kansas plains, the city would undergo a dramatic transformation, changing its very face. For every single coin spent in Dodge City's bustling red light district, someone somewhere in town was fervently praying for its complete damnation. The ringing church bells rang just as fiercely as the clanging saloon pianos played, and the self-righteous moral crusaders of the frontier made it their unwavering mission to completely clean up Dodge once and for all. Yet for all of their carefully worded sermons and manufactured public outrage, even the most outwardly righteous citizens knew deep down that, without a little sin, the city would slowly starve to death. The local newspapers printed pious condemnations in one meticulously crafted column, and then blatant advertisements for whiskey and bustling dance halls in the very next. Fierce ministers thundered loudly from their pulpits about the fearsome wrath of God, while conveniently accepting the quiet donations of the very same brothel madams who quietly financed the local orphanages and much-needed church repairs. It was an open secret that the thriving red light district discreetly paid for the town's very salvation. Preachers and passionate reformers often targeted the worn women, and not the men who frequented their rooms. Fallen angels, they loudly called them, urging them all to repent while completely ignoring the countless ranchers, lawmen, and businessmen who visited those very same houses every single night. Some particularly fervent reform groups even tried to close the raucous brothels down entirely, claiming that it was their sacred moral duty. But the shrewd city council typically hesitated. Far too many pockets were discreetly lined with lucrative vice money. The corrupt mayors, the indifferent sheriffs, even the greedy undertakers all benefited handsomely. Every single dollar that passed through the red lamps eventually made its way into the respectable hands. A handful of zealous ministers took their increasingly desperate war directly to the streets. What they ended up with was a spongy lump called a bloom, which was full of slag, carbon, and what I can only describe as divine chaos. Today, we'd call that low-quality stuff. Back then, it was just metal that didn't fall apart the second it got rained on. And here's the real kicker. Those impurities, the very things that modern factories spend millions trying to remove, are the reason medieval iron lasted so long. The slag sealed up microscopic cracks. The carbon toughened the surface. And the phosphorus, which every modern metallurgist hates, created a self-healing barrier against rust. In short, their metal was dirty, it was uneven, and it was pretty much invincible, unlike your modern steel. Modern steel is pure, it's efficient, and it's manufactured to rust evenly, like some kind of democratic tragedy. The big difference is that medieval iron wasn't designed by a committee. It was beaten into existence by some dude named Edric who hadn't slept in 3 days and was probably still mad about his cow. As that imperfect iron aged, it developed a dark, glossy skin called patina, which protected it from moisture. Every scratch just made it stronger, kind of like trauma, but for metal. And because nothing was mass-produced back then, every hinge, every nail, every chain was forged individually, each with its own unique quirks. Every strike of the hammer left behind microscopic variations. Flaws, character, resilience. So, the next time you see an 800-year-old iron gate outlasting your car's brake lines, remember this. It didn't survive because it was perfect. It survived because it was stubborn, impure, and made by somebody who genuinely didn't care about efficiency, just permanence. If medieval metallurgy had a slogan, it would have been, "We don't know why it works, but it does." The blacksmiths of the Middle Ages operated somewhere in between engineers and sorcerers. No textbooks, no safety codes, and absolutely no concept of quality control. Scratch it, expose it to salt, or even just sneeze in its general direction, and that protective film crumbles. Once it's gone, the metal corrodes faster than your willpower at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Medieval iron, meanwhile, didn't bother with any of that fancy invisible layer nonsense. It built its defenses right into its very core impurities, slag, and carbon that waged war on corrosion from the inside out. No deceptive coatings, no false promises, just good old-fashioned chemistry and sheer stubbornness. Stainless steel was dreamed up in 1913 by metallurgists desperately chasing after the modern obsession with perfection. They wanted metal that looked pristine and required absolutely zero maintenance, because nothing screams progress quite like getting monumentally lazy about upkeep. It worked, sort of. Stainless steel is ideal for things like scalpels, kitchen sinks, and achieving that oh-so-desirable shiny, modern kitchen aesthetic. But compared to medieval iron, it's a high-maintenance celebrity with a skincare routine that costs more than your mortgage. Here's where the irony really kicks in. The term stainless doesn't even mean won't stain. It means stains less. It's a linguistic sleight of hand, like calling a medieval dungeon ventilation optional. Medieval blacksmiths never had the audacity to claim their work was rust-proof. They were well aware that it would age, darken, and transform over time. And that was precisely the point. Their iron wasn't engaged in a futile battle against nature. It was actively cooperating with it. Stainless steel tries to outsmart nature and ends up losing miserably every rainy season. If you ever feel the urge to humble yourself, try comparing a medieval blacksmith's life's work to your IKEA bookshelf. His creation is still out there, probably holding up a cathedral somewhere. Yours is already wobbling precariously. It was a losing war, fought with crude sticks and noxious smoke, and the cunning enemy always came back hungrier than ever before. To even stand a chance of outsmarting them, seasoned rat catchers studied their elusive prey like dedicated scholars of vermin. They knew that rats strongly preferred warmth, a plentiful supply of grain, and copious amounts of filth. They also knew that they unerringly followed the tantalizing scent of food through the tiniest cracks and the deepest drains. In the dead of night, a truly skilled catcher could accurately trace the precise location of an entire colony simply by relying on his keen sense of smell, the faint but unmistakable odor of grease, accumulated waste, and pervasive fear. Some catchers even swore that they could discern the subtle difference between black rats and brown rats simply by listening to the sounds they made in the darkness. The black rats were noticeably smaller, exceptionally faster, and far more dangerous, carrying the fleas that relentlessly spread the deadly plague. Entire cities became sprawling battlegrounds, not of clashing swords and charging knights, but of a constant struggle for survival. In seemingly innocuous grain stores, bustling taverns, busy bakeries, and sprawling monasteries, the ubiquitous rats reigned supreme. The seasoned catcher moved through this chaotic landscape like a wraith-like shadow, flickering torch held aloft in one hand, tendrils of thick smoke curling ominously behind him. His very presence was as much a ritualistic performance as it was a practical method of pest control, a bizarre blend of superstition, rudimentary science, and sheer, unadulterated grit. Some whispered that certain gifted rat catchers could somehow speak directly to the elusive creatures, luring them out of their hidden lairs with whispered chants or haunting whistles. Still, superstition was a double-edged sword. Fear inspired respect, or at least a certain amount of hesitation. A cunning rat catcher could easily use that fear to his advantage. He would arrive cloaked in darkness, his face partially hidden, speaking in a hushed voice. He'd let the townspeople wonder if he was even human. If they feared him, they'd pay him faster and ask fewer questions. In the bustling cities, where the number of rats and people were about the same, the rat catcher's strange aura became part of the city's folklore. Mothers would warn their children that if they didn't keep clean or say their prayers, the rat man would come in the dead of night and haul them off in his sack. He was the boogeyman, and the savior rolled into one, cleansing the world while reminding everyone how filthy it really was. By the dim light of a candle, even he wasn't sure which role was the real one anymore. When he stared into the rat's gleaming eyes in the darkness, he sometimes wondered who was hunting whom. By the late Middle Ages, the rat catcher's world was starting to shift. Towns grew larger, the streets became more crowded, and walls were built higher. But the rats remained. They adapted far more quickly than any human reform. As sanitation slowly improved and city laws started to forbid the dumping of garbage into the streets, the catcher found fewer places to ply his trade and fewer people willing to pay for it. The trade that had once sustained him was now fading from memory. He still roamed the land, sacks slung over his shoulder, smoke pot in hand, following rumors of infestations from one dilapidated village to the next. Children no longer threw stones. Instead, they just stared with curiosity at this relic from a bygone era. He was a walking ghost of a time before proper hygiene, before sewers and soap. In some towns, his arrival caused more fascination than fear. Lanterns would flicker to life, casting dancing shadows, Piano keys would clang boisterously through open windows, and the unmistakable perfume of whiskey, mingled with the pungent odor of sweat and sin, would drift lazily through the air. This was the other Dodge, the one that the fire and brimstone preachers warned their congregations about, and the very same one that the cowboys dreamed of longingly as they were out on the lonely trail. Along the infamous south side of Front Street, where L's lantern burned ever so dimly, stood the red light district, a place where pleasure and survival danced precariously hand in hand. Brothels, saloons, and gambling dens lined the muddy, rutted road. Each doorway glowed a lurid crimson from the soft, suggestive light of the oil lamps that hung above them. Inside, men laughed far too loudly and drank far too hard, desperately hoping to drown the ghosts that seemed to eternally follow them west. The women of Dodge were called many names, none of them particularly flattering. Soiled doves, painted ladies, scarlet angels. Society spat those words out like curses, but behind the sneers lay a grudging dependence. Without them, Dodge's entire economy would have very quickly collapsed. These women kept the money flowing freely when the cattle drives had stopped coming through. They eagerly bought food, promptly paid rent, and spent what the cowboys earned faster than the saloon keepers could pour another round of drinks. Many of them had come from hard luck circumstances. They were widows, runaways, or women who were simply too desperately poor to survive in any other way. They were just as much a vital part of Dodge's rough and tumble frontier fabric as the gunslingers and the gamblers. They marched boldly into the heart of the district with worn hymn books and righteous fire in their eyes, calling loudly on the women to abandon their sinful ways and fully embrace the loving Lord. But the knowing soiled doves knew better than that. For far too many of them, repentance simply meant slow starvation. There were simply no second chances for a woman with a shady past, only harsh judgment and condemnation. Some mocked the fire and brimstone preachers openly. Others simply shut their doors tightly and went right back to work. Ironically, the pragmatic madams often did far more for the truly poor than the established churches ever did. They quietly paid for medicine, funded decent burials, and even took in orphan children from the very men who had eagerly frequented their private rooms. Their compassion was entirely practical and not outwardly pious, an unholy charity that the town relied on heavily, but stubbornly refused to openly acknowledge. By day, Dodge City stubbornly wore its carefully constructed Sunday face, the melodious choir singing sweetly, and the local press preaching the many virtues of hard work and honesty. But when darkness fell once again, the seductive lamps glowed a vibrant red again, and the very same moral guardians conveniently pretended not to hear the raucous laughter echoing across the seemingly endless plains. Hypocrisy, like cheap whiskey, flowed freely through the rough streets, and both somehow managed to keep Dodge running. By the late 1880s, Dodge City had slowly begun to sober up. The wild cattle drives dwindled dramatically. The steadily advancing railroad brought new families and enterprising merchants, and the once wildly rowdy cow town started to pretend to be somewhat civilized. The famous gunfighters all moved on to greener pastures. Wyatt Earp to Arizona, Bat Masterson to Denver, and with them went the constant chaos that had stubbornly defined the city's bygone glory days. And yet, somehow, they managed to produce iron that could outlive empires and probably your warranty. The heart of their operation was the bloomer, which was basically a glorified mud chimney stuffed with charcoal, ore, and a whole lot of hope. Inside, air was pumped in by bellows that squealed like a bunch of dying pigs, creating just enough heat to soften the iron, but not melt it. What came out was a lump, a messy, spongy ball they called a bloom, that was somewhere between metal and regret. From there, the blacksmith would reheat it and hammer it mercilessly, driving out bits of slag, folding layers, and occasionally cursing loud enough to qualify as a prayer. The whole process was brutally slow. If your local ironmonger promised delivery in 3 days, he meant 3 moons and several existential crises. And yet, the imperfection of this method was its magic. The uneven heat, the random carbon content, the traces of silica and phosphorus, all mixed together to form a kind of accidental supermetal. Every piece of iron was unique, unpredictable, and weirdly self-preserving. In short, the blacksmith was producing the metallurgical equivalent of sourdough bread, alive, inconsistent, and practically indestructible. Today's steel is made in sterile factories, measured in decimals, polished to a mirror finish, and designed to fail with dignity. Medieval iron, on the other hand, looked like it had already survived the apocalypse before it even left the forge. It was pitted, lumpy, and occasionally hissed when it got touched by rain, but it refused to die. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The medieval forge was a filthy, smoke-choked hole in the ground, and yet it achieved something that our clean, computerized factories can't: longevity. When you compare their chaotic, hand-forged artistry to your mass-produced drill bit, it's like comparing a monk's manuscript to an IKEA instruction sheet. Somewhere between the 13th century and the advent of same-day shipping, humanity collectively forgot the critical difference between building something and merely manufacturing something. The medieval forge wasn't just a workshop, it was a deeply held philosophy. Every spark, every resounding strike of the hammer was imbued with intention. The smith wasn't simply shaping metal, he was testing the limits of his patience, his physical strength, and occasionally his sanity. His process was deliberately slow, undeniably messy, and terrifyingly loud, the metallic heartbeat of civilization itself. He embraced imperfections because he existed in an imperfect world. He didn't view flaws as failures, but as an integral part of the material's unique character, something to be guided and coaxed, not ruthlessly erased. When the metal stubbornly resisted, he adjusted his rhythm accordingly. When it cracked, he simply folded it again. In a way, the forge acted as a mirror, reflecting the smith's inner state. If he lost focus or succumbed to his temper, the iron would swiftly punish him for it. Modern metallurgy has completely forgotten this intricate dance. We treat iron as a disposable resource, not a valuable relationship. Machines handle it now efficiently, emotionlessly, rolling it, stamping it, packaging it with robotic precision. The end result is a plethora of products that might look dazzlingly shiny on the surface, but are destined to fall apart before their time. They're perfect right up until the moment they're not, and then they're unceremoniously tossed aside and replaced with something newer, shinier, and equally ephemeral. The medieval smith would have been utterly horrified, not by the technology itself, but by the underlying attitude. To him, crafting metal was an act of profound humility. You didn't attempt to conquer nature. You forged a collaborative partnership with it. Others firmly believed that their unique smell alone, a potent combination of half-human and half-decay, instinctively drove the vermin into a state of frenzied panic. But the cunning rats invariably fought back with every tooth and claw at their disposal. They bit, clawed, and swarmed with unwavering ferocity when cornered, fighting for their very survival. Many a seasoned catcher bore the grim testament of these nocturnal battles on his arms and ankles, thin, crescent-shaped marks where desperate teeth had broken the skin. Some unlucky souls succumbed to deadly fevers days later and never rose from their sickbeds again. Yet there was simply no quitting, no honorable way to surrender this relentless fight. To leave the rats unchecked meant widespread famine, devastating disease, and the complete and utter ruin of entire communities. And so the endless battle continued, largely unseen and unappreciated by those it was meant to protect. Beneath the cobbled streets, inside the damp monastery cellars, underneath the overflowing market stalls, and throughout the rotting rafters of sprawling manors, the struggle relentlessly raged on. The hunter had inextricably become part of the city's faltering immune system, unwanted, to be sure, but absolutely essential to its continued survival. Every rat killed was a small, hard-won victory. Every night successfully survived was a minor miracle in itself. And though no one ever truly thanked him for his vital efforts, the weary rat catcher fully understood his grim purpose. He fought, not for glittering gold or fleeting glory, but for a fragile, plague-ridden peace. When the dreaded Black Death relentlessly swept through Europe, leaving a trail of unparalleled death and devastation in its wake, the rat catcher's already grim trade took on an almost prophetic quality. Towns that had once scornfully mocked his lingering odor now desperately begged for his immediate presence. He'd spin yarns about the plague years, of rats as large as cats, of nights when scratching noises echoed through every wall. Few believed him, but they still listened. Some rat catchers took on apprentices, passing down their grim wisdom. How to track by smell. How to kill without laying a hand on them. How to recognize when a rat was clever enough to outsmart a trap. But most died without leaving behind any legacy. Their names were forgotten, their bones buried outside the city walls. No tombstones marked their final resting place, only the lack of scratching under the floorboards. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the rat catcher had become a figure of folklore. In German towns, tales circulated about the Ratenfänger, the Pied Piper, a mysterious character who lured away both rats and children with his enchanting music. Historians would later suggest that the tale was based on a real person, perhaps a rat catcher who vanished after a job went horribly wrong. Myth had swallowed history whole, but in truth, the rat catcher's spirit never truly vanished. He lived on in every pest control technician who crawled into an attic, every laborer who faced filth to keep others safe. The tools changed. Smoke became chemical, stick became steel, but the mission stayed the same: to combat the dark things that thrive when humans grow careless. And somewhere in the silence of an old European cellar, the scratching still begins at night. A faint reminder that the rat catcher's work is never truly finished. Before the fire department even existed, before alarms or hydrants or neatly arranged buckets, there were men in towers, the fire watchers. From dawn until the deep hours of the night, their eyes scanned the wooden frameworks of medieval cities, searching for the first hint of smoke. Every thatched roof, every chimney, every flickering torch below was a potential disaster waiting to ignite. Some of them worked in small, cramped cribs, one-room shacks lit by a single lantern, while others earned their keep in the grander parlor houses where fancy lace curtains and elegant piano music tried desperately to disguise the true nature of the trade. Marshal Bat Masterson and Sheriff Wyatt Earp could generally keep some semblance of order in the streets, but even they knew better than to delve too deeply into the red light maze. The town's vices were simply far too profitable, far too essential to the town's survival. Everyone, from the lowliest barkeep to the wealthiest banker, benefited handsomely from what went on behind those closed and lamplit doors. When the night wind blew relentlessly across the plains, carrying the sounds of fiddles and laughter, Dodge City seemed to pulse like a living, breathing thing, wild, dangerous, and undeniably beautiful. In that district of flickering red light, the frontier's very heart beat fastest, where the long arm of the law ended and raw, untamed lust began. They were the very backbone of Dodge City's nighttime economy, the so-called soiled doves. Behind the delicate lace curtains and the smoky glow of lanterns, these women skillfully turned desire into a lucrative business. Their fleeting beauty was a currency in a town that ran primarily on hunger and gold. But to survive in this environment meant much more than simple charm. It required cunning, exceptional endurance, and a willingness to play a very dangerous game in a city that was ruled by men with quick guns and even quicker tempers. Most of the women had come west chasing after the very same dream as the cowboys: freedom and fortune. Some were abandoned wives, others were orphaned or farmers' daughters who had run away from their suffocating, nowhere towns. A few had once worked as singers, waitresses, or seamstresses, before sheer hardship had driven them into the red light trade. Whatever their past might have been, Dodge didn't ask too many questions. But as the gun smoke finally cleared, the alluring red lights along bustling Front Street began to dim, one by one. The city fathers, increasingly eager to attract legitimate business, turned spitefully on the very same district that had steadily built their fortunes. New laws were hastily passed banning prostitution inside the existing city limits, though everyone knew that the women simply moved a few blocks farther south. Saloons were forced to close much earlier, gambling was severely restricted, and the ever-present reformers celebrated what they eagerly called the cleansing of Dodge. Yet those who had lived through its wildest years understood the harsh truth all too well, that the city's very heart was being carved out in the false name of respectability. Many of the worn women vanished from sight as suddenly as they had originally appeared. Some followed the well-worn trail of sin westward to the bustling cities of Denver or San Francisco. Others simply faded into well-deserved anonymity, their hard-earned names forever lost to the vast prairie wind. A precious few tried desperately to start new, honest lives, as dedicated seamstresses, talented cooks, and even willing wives. But their tarnished pasts clung to them like cheap perfume. Dodge had used them relentlessly, loved them fleetingly, and ultimately forgotten them all in the very same breath. The bustling brothels were torn down one by one, their seductive red lanterns extinguished for good. The grandest of them all, Dora Hand's opulent parlor, burned completely to the ground not long after her untimely death, as if the town itself desperately wanted to erase the lasting memory of its lustful youth. In their place rose gleaming churches, well-funded schools, and neat white homes, all pristine monuments to surface virtue built squarely on a solid foundation laid by unforgiving vice. Yet the restless ghosts of the infamous red light district never fully left. In the modern world, we worship purity, pure steel, pure ingredients, pure intentions. Medieval blacksmiths, on the other hand, worshipped survival. They didn't care about purity. They cared about whether their door hinge would outlast the next plague. And that's why they accidentally created one of history's greatest engineering miracles: slag. Slag was the unwanted byproduct of smelting iron, a gooey mess of silica, charcoal, lime, and whatever else happened to fall into the furnace that week. Most modern metallurgists would call it contamination. Medieval smiths called it Tuesday. Every lump of iron they forged was riddled with these tiny, glassy inclusions, scattered like freckles across its body. And that's what saved it. The slag didn't just sit there. It worked. Those microscopic specks sealed the surface, forming a kind of patchwork armor that blocked oxygen and moisture from sinking in. Essentially, every piece of medieval iron had built-in self-defense, a chemical version of no trespassing. Modern steel, by comparison, is just too darn clean. It's like a bodybuilder who looks amazing but gets the flu twice a month. We refine, polish, and homogenize everything until there's nothing left to protect it from nature. When your stainless steel sink starts corroding after a few years, that's not bad luck. It's design. But medieval iron was gloriously dirty. The slag acted like nature's epoxy, filling gaps and holding the metal together. Some pieces even developed a glassy outer crust that made them practically immortal. You can still see this on centuries-old gates and swords, a dark, shimmering skin that looks like black marble. That's the slag doing its job long after its maker turned to dust. The best part is the blacksmiths had no idea why it worked. They thought the ore from certain regions was blessed, or that their forged smoke had mystical properties. The iron originated from the earth, the fire from the forest, the air from your very own lungs. It was all part of an interconnected cycle, one that modern progress has proudly paved over with concrete and indifference. Even the blacksmith's well-worn tools reflected this unwavering patience. His hammer would gradually wear down over the decades, becoming an extension of his own hand. His anvil grew smoother with age, bearing witness to countless transformations. He didn't simply throw them away and buy new ones. He adapted to their evolving form, just as his apprentices adapted to his notoriously unpredictable temper. Nothing in his world was considered disposable. Today, we churn out things that outlive our rapidly dwindling attention spans, but not our own lifetimes. The smith, on the other hand, built things that could potentially outlive entire dynasties. So perhaps the real lesson here isn't about metallurgy at all. It's about our fundamental mindset. The blacksmith didn't relentlessly strive for the newest, most cutting-edge technology. He strived for something far more elusive: permanence. And, ironically, that's exactly what he achieved. If the Middle Ages bequeathed us one lasting miracle, it wasn't the imposing castles or the soaring cathedrals. It was iron that simply refused to die. Centuries later, it still hangs from ancient church doors, anchors bridges that have weathered countless storms, and guards the tombs of forgotten kings, quietly mocking every rusted-out car and crumbling skyscraper humanity has slapped together since. Empires rose and fell, languages vanished into the mists of time. But that unassuming medieval iron is still stubbornly there, still diligently doing its job, probably rolling its metaphorical molecular eyes at our modern-day follies. That unparalleled durability wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a direct result of the prevailing attitude. Church bells tolled mournfully for the countless dead, carts piled high with decaying corpses rolled through the deserted streets, and behind it all, the omnipresent rats continued to feast and breed with sickening abandon. The catcher's thankless work was no longer merely about keeping the city's food supply safe from contamination. It was now about desperately trying to keep what remained of humanity alive against seemingly insurmountable odds. But even he, with all of his hard-won skills and gritty determination, was ultimately powerless against the invisible killer that tenaciously clung to the fleas. The horrifying symptoms came on with terrifying speed. Raging fever, grotesque swelling, agonizing pain, blackened skin that felt like it was burning from the inside out. And soon, even the bravest and most experienced catchers began to vanish, claimed by the relentless pestilence that they had dedicated their lives to fighting. Some desperate towns outlawed the trade entirely, claiming that the rat catchers actually brought the dreaded plague with them, rather than preventing it from spreading. Others treated them as revered holy men, believing that they were uniquely capable of driving out death and disease with their noxious smoke pots and their well-worn sticks. It was a terrifying time when superstition and utter desperation blurred together into one indistinguishable mass. Rat catchers in the plague years walked the ravaged streets like ghosts, shrouded in tattered rags and utterly drenched in pungent vinegar, desperately hoping to ward off the all-encompassing death that swirled around them. They crammed handfuls of strong, smelling herbs into their nostrils and muttered frantic prayers to Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of those suffering from the plague. They burned rat nests by the dozen, using copious amounts of sulfur and pitch until the air itself turned thick and poisonous. In an age where a single spark could wipe out an entire neighborhood, these men were the guardians of survival. They climbed narrow spiral staircases that snaked through stone bell towers and church spires, emerging into the bitter wind. From up there, they had a commanding view of the world. Rooftops stretched out beneath them like tinder. Markets were bustling with smoke rising from countless hearths. Theirs was a solitary post, but it was a vital one. They were the city's eyes, watching while everyone else slept. The danger wasn't just the flames. It was also complacency. Medieval towns were incredibly compact, houses leaning into each other like drunken friends, alleys so narrow that a man could barely squeeze through. Roofs were thatched with straw, beams were made of oak, walls were bone dry. One overturned candle, one kitchen fire, and the blaze would jump across the street before the church bells even started to ring. The fire watcher's entire job depended on mere seconds, spotting smoke before it turned into a monster. Up there, they learned to interpret smoke as if it were sacred text. White smoke meant a hearth. Dark smoke meant trouble. They could tell if it came from damp wood, oil, or pitch. On stormy nights, when lightning struck close by, they stood ready, gripping the ropes that hung from the bell above them. One pull and the city would awaken to utter chaos. For their service, most earned barely enough coins to buy food and a cot near the base of the tower. Yet their work held the weight of thousands of lives. When dawn broke and the sun painted the rooftops gold, they remained at their post, squinting through the haze and chimney dust, hoping the day would end as quietly as it began. Because if they missed even a single wisp of smoke, by evening there would be nothing left to watch, only ashes and the faint echo of a bell that rang far too late. The medieval fire watcher's world revolved around height. The moment they stepped into the district, they became part of its inner workings, nameless, essential, and ultimately disposable. There were also classes among them. The lowest of the low worked in the cribs, tiny, bare rooms with a single bed, a simple wash basin, and just enough space for business. These women earned very little and aged extremely fast. Those with a bit of luck or undeniable charm found places in the parlor houses, where the furniture was plush velvet, the whiskey was of a far superior quality, and the clientele was much wealthier. Here, the women were expected to sing, dance, and flirt just as much as they were expected to entertain. Sophistication sold just as well as bare skin. Some even rose to fleeting fame within Dodge, becoming local legends in their own right. Big Nose Kate, the longtime companion of Doc Holliday, had once worked the district before following him down the outlaw trail. Others, like French Mary and Squirrel Tooth Alice, were as well known as any gunslinger who had ever graced the town. They were sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, and even quicker to draw a knife if a client forgot his manners. But beneath all of the rouge and perfume lay bone-deep exhaustion. Disease, violence, and sheer heartbreak claimed most of them before they ever reached the age of 30. Respectable society flatly refused to bury them within the city limits. So the Boot Hill Cemetery quickly filled with nameless graves marked only by simple wooden crosses. Still, the soiled doves somehow managed to keep the town alive. Their hard-earned earnings paid the musicians, the bartenders, the shopkeepers, and even the very preachers who condemned them every Sunday. And when the cattle herds finally arrived each spring, the cowboys didn't head straight for the church. Instead, they rode straight for the welcoming red lights of Dodge. In Dodge City, virtue might have been in short supply, but business was always booming. Travelers still whispered in hushed tones about the many women who had once ruled the long nights, their joyous laughter stubbornly echoing through the passage of time. The captivating legends of Dodge's weary doves eventually became part of the enduring myth of the Old West, tragic, undeniably romantic, and all too often half-forgotten. By the time bright electric lamps had completely replaced the warm glow of flickering oil lanterns, the alluring glow of sin had slowly faded into wistful nostalgia. But for a precious few blazing decades, Dodge City's infamous red lights had burned brighter than any star high above the endless Kansas plains. And the defiant women who had bravely lit them had steadfastly kept the frontier's wildly beating heart alive long after the thunderous gunfire had finally stopped. They didn't realize they were running one of the most sophisticated corrosion resistance experiments in human history, by accident. So yeah, medieval iron lasted for centuries because it was full of junk. Modern steel fails because it isn't, which just goes to show. Sometimes perfection is overrated, and a little bit of garbage can keep you alive for 800 years. Before the Industrial Revolution and its obsession with efficiency, medieval blacksmiths had a simpler relationship with technology. Hit it until it works. And if it still doesn't, hit it again, but angrier. Their furnaces weren't powered by coal or oil. They ran on charcoal, the original renewable energy source for people who didn't even know they were being environmentally friendly. Charcoal was made by slowly burning wood in a low-oxygen pit until it became light, carbon-rich, and ready to ruin a blacksmith's lungs. It was hot enough to soften iron, but not melt it, a blessing in disguise. See, melting the iron would have removed the impurities that made it so durable. Instead, the lower heat kept all that glorious trash chemistry locked inside as the iron simmered away in the bloomer. The charcoal infused it with carbon atoms. This process, known today as carburization, transformed the surface into iron carbide, a tough, dark layer that resisted corrosion. To a blacksmith, it just looked like success. He didn't know carbon was bonding with iron. He just knew his blade didn't fall apart when it rained. The best part is, charcoal didn't just make the metal stronger. Coated it in soot, sealing it under a natural black patina. That patina didn't flake off like modern paint. It aged like a protective tattoo. You could scratch it, dent it, leave it outside for a century, and it would still look like it had stories to tell. Modern industry replaced charcoal with coke, a faster, hotter, cleaner fuel. It gave us shiny metal that looked great on factory floors and terrible anywhere else. Medieval blacksmiths weren't building for the next quarterly earnings report. They were building for eternity. Every meticulously crafted hinge and every razor-sharp sword was a timeless message hurled defiantly into the face of time itself. Give it your best shot, but you'll ultimately lose. They didn't outsource their craftsmanship to soulless machines or shave precious minutes off their painstaking process in the name of efficiency. Their forges ran on a potent cocktail of patience, back-breaking sweat, and a healthy dose of disregard for the relentless pursuit of speed. Meanwhile, we've somehow mastered the art of disposable everything. Our tools are often rusting before the warranty even expires. Our glass and steel skyscrapers require constant repainting and upkeep, and our grandest innovations mostly boil down to making things thinner, weaker, and more susceptible to planned obsolescence so we can gleefully buy them all over again next year. Progress, it seems, now comes in predictable cycles of corrosion. What little remains of medieval iron tells a drastically different story. It was forged imperfectly, maintained obsessively, and respected almost religiously. It didn't just valiantly resist the ravages of time, it actively collaborated with them. With each passing year, a delicate film of oxide painstakingly built upon itself, gradually sealing the metal tighter, making it tougher and more resilient than ever before. Medieval iron didn't wage a losing war against decay. It aged gracefully into a state of unyielding strength. There's something undeniably poetic about that. The magnificent cathedrals that house it have been struck by lightning, relentlessly shelled by armies during wars, and painstakingly rebuilt by unwavering faith. Yet their humble iron fittings still tenaciously cling to the ancient stone, blackened and serene, as if quietly whispering, "I told you so." The terrified rats fled in every direction down open drains, across crumbling rooftops, even directly over piles of rotting corpses, and the determined catcher relentlessly followed, driven by a mixture of grim duty and sheer desperation. For some unlucky souls, the job slowly devolved into a descent into complete and utter madness. Surrounded by unimaginable death and crushing isolation, they began to irrationally believe that the rats could actually speak to them, that the vermin carried not just disease, but terrifying messages directly from the depths of hell itself. Chroniclers of the time recounted stories of catchers who disturbingly dreamed of black rivers teeming with rats, of the gnawing sound of razor-sharp teeth whispering insidious threats in the all-consuming darkness. Whether it was sheer delirium or crippling guilt, the nightmarish visions relentlessly haunted the men who somehow managed to survive the seemingly endless ordeal. Yet without these unsung heroes, entire towns would undoubtedly have fallen even faster, succumbing completely to the unbridled pestilence. When the plague finally retreated, leaving streets eerily empty and unsettlingly silent, the weary rat catcher stubbornly remained, half mad from the constant trauma, and poorer than ever before. He had faced the specter of death on a daily basis, and still he had nothing tangible to show for his heroic efforts but the countless scars that adorned his body, and the faint but lingering stench of smoke and ash that would forever cling to his clothes. In the end, the harrowing plague years ultimately proved what few people wanted to honestly admit: that civilization was always precariously balanced, forever teetering on the edge of complete collapse, and often only one disease-ridden rat away from utter destruction. And the man most despised by society, the filthy rat catcher who toiled tirelessly in the darkest alleys, was perhaps the only one who truly understood that chilling truth. His tower was both a fortress and a prison, a lonely stone perch towering over the maze of rooftops. Some towers were built for defense, others for bells, or simply out of civic pride. But all served a second, more practical purpose: constant vigilance. Cities like Paris, Cologne, and Florence stationed men at the very top of their tallest structures, where they could see for miles in every direction. From that elevated vantage point, a fire was no longer a minor household accident. It was a storm cloud made of smoke and utter devastation. The towers themselves were incredibly varied. In some towns, the fire watcher climbed the church steeple, ascending twisting staircases slick with damp stone. In others, he stood atop city walls or on rudimentary wooden scaffolding hastily built for the task. The higher the tower, the safer the city, but the more isolated the man. He might spend 12 hours or more in absolute silence, accompanied only by the wind and the distant tolling of bells below. The equipment was simple: a spyglass if he was lucky, a horn or bell rope, a lantern, and a thick wool cloak to ward off the cold. Many cities forbade the use of fire at the watch post. The irony was not lost on them, so a warm drink was a rare luxury. He ate bread hardened by the wind, drank from a flask, and watched, always watched. His entire existence depended on his eyesight never failing him. Each tower had its own unique routine. Every hour, the watcher was required to signal that everything was all right. In some places, a bell would ring once at midnight, a gentle reassurance that the city still stood. If he failed to ring it, panic could easily spread through the streets below. And when smoke did rise, there was no time for hesitation. The bells were rung in a frenzied rhythm, the alarm echoing through stone and wood. Within moments, the entire city would know that fire had arrived. When dawn finally arrived, another man would climb the tower to relieve him, The red light district wasn't merely a den of vice. It was, in fact, a well-oiled economic engine disguised in perfume and sawdust. Every single coin that clinked noisily across a bar or slipped suggestively beneath a petticoat found its way back into the town's financial veins. The saloon owners, the gamblers, and even the lawmen all had a substantial stake in this intricate dance of money and sin. The cowboys were, without a doubt, the lifeblood of it all. After months of driving cattle across the endless, desolate plains, they arrived in Dodge half-mad with exhaustion and pockets heavy with cash. The moment they were paid, their pockets burned with the need to spend it. They hit Front Street in massive waves. First the saloons, then the gambling halls, and finally the brothels. Whiskey loosened both tongues and morals alike, and by midnight the entire town seemed to pulse with riotous laughter, raucous music, and the unmistakable rattle of poker chips. The women knew the rhythm of it all extremely well. They were both temptation and therapist, listening intently to the rambling stories of lost herds, dead friends, and the agonizing ache of loneliness that only the vast plains could breed. For a few fleeting dollars, a cowboy could buy not just a body, but an illusion as well. Warmth, genuine affection, and the comforting feeling that he wasn't completely forgotten by the outside world. Behind all of the glitter and glamour, though, the business was ruthlessly efficient. Every bottle consumed, every game played, and every visit made was carefully tallied and rigorously taxed. The brothel madams kept strict accounts, and the city officials quietly took their cut without a word. Even the preachers benefited indirectly. Sin filled the collection plates far faster than sermons ever could. The women, of course, saw very little of all that profit. By burning hotter, coke stripped out the phosphorus and other impurities of the very ingredients that made medieval iron immortal. Charcoal gave medieval metal its soul. Coke gave ours a midlife crisis. The blacksmiths, covered in soot and sweat, unknowingly mastered the first sustainable metallurgy. Slow, imperfect, and stubbornly organic. Every spark from their forges carried carbon, history, and the faint smell of accidental genius. If medieval metallurgy had a patron saint, it would be phosphorus, the element that made iron last for centuries, and ironically, the one that modern engineers now treat like a toxic coworker. You'll rarely find a factory bragging, "Now with 3% more phosphorus." But in the Middle Ages, this impurity was quietly saving the world, one hinge at a time. Here's the short version. The ore they used wasn't pure. It came from swampy bog iron deposits or rocky hills loaded with phosphorus. Normally, that would make modern steel too brittle for mass production. But medieval blacksmiths didn't care about mass production. They cared about making one thing that didn't die before winter. When they smelted that phosphorus-rich, or in their bloomeries, something miraculous happened. The phosphorus bonded with the surface of the iron, creating a thin, invisible shield that slowed down corrosion, a natural, self-forming armor. Scientists today call it a phosphate passivation layer. Medieval people called it luck and went back to hitting things with hammers. The magic of phosphorus is that it makes the surface hydrophobic, water slides off instead of soaking in. Think of it like medieval Teflon, but less convenient and more likely to give you tetanus if handled incorrectly. This microscopic barrier meant their iron didn't rot away in damp cathedrals, even when the walls themselves were sweating. Modern steel, by contrast, is purified within an inch of its life. It has witnessed kings crowned, nations crumble into dust, and entire industrial revolutions come and go like fleeting fads, all while your car battery gives up the ghost if you so much as look at it the wrong way. The lesson here transcends the realm of mere metallurgy. It's about how we choose to treat the things we create, the values we imbue them with, and the legacy we hope to leave behind. The blacksmith built for lasting permanence because permanence was synonymous with unwavering pride. We build for fleeting convenience because convenience has somehow become synonymous with unadulterated profit. Their iron endures against all odds because it was never intended to be casually replaced. Before dawn had even cracked over the crooked, time-worn roofs of medieval Europe, a faint rustling sound could already be detected in the labyrinthine gutters, the unmistakable sound of 1,000 tiny claws scratching against the damp stone. The rats were already wide awake, and they effectively owned the night, swarming through the refuse-strewn streets of cities that reeked of decay, acrid smoke, and utter desperation. And somewhere in that pitch-black darkness, another creature stirred to life, the rat catcher, a man who occupied a nebulous social space, neither noble enough to command respect, nor so utterly despised as to be cast out entirely. He trudged wearily through the grimy alleyways with a burlap sack slung heavily over one shoulder, a sturdy club clutched tightly in his calloused hand, and a peculiar stick tipped with sharpened wire in the other. He was certainly no knight in shining armor, but he was an absolutely vital cog in the machinery of medieval urban life. In an age when the bubonic plague traveled unseen, hitching a ride on the backs of disease-ridden vermin, the humble rat catcher was often the only thing standing between a town's fragile survival and utter pestilence. Every seasoned rat catcher possessed his own carefully guarded secrets and invaluable tricks of the trade. The inherently dangerous work wasn't simply about brute strength and blind luck. It required cunning, impeccable timing, and a deep understanding of the power of fear. Rats, after all, were far cleverer than most men gave them credit for. They diligently remembered distinct smells, readily recognized repeated patterns, and could intuitively sense impending danger. To effectively trap them, the seasoned catcher had to essentially think like one. He learned to move almost silently through the darkness, to carefully read the subtle signs, fresh droppings near a newly delivered flour sack, tiny teeth marks gnawed into sturdy wooden beams, the faint shuffling sound behind a plaster wall. He'd often sprinkle a thin layer of flour across a floor before retiring for the night, hoping to see tiny footprints in the morning, revealing the exact paths the elusive creatures traversed in the darkness. He'd strategically bait his traps, not with an abundance of tempting food, but with a carefully calculated scarcity. A single, unassuming piece of meat, deliberately left untouched for days, patiently waiting until the increasingly bold rats grew trusting enough to finally approach it. Patience, he knew, was as vitally important as any weapon in his arsenal. Many catchers proudly developed their own unique concoctions of bait, each one claiming to be more effective than the last. One stubbornly swore by a revolting mixture of rancid blood and stale beer, while another fervently touted the irresistible allure of burnt bread thoroughly soaked in cheap lamp oil. There were also whispered recipes for potent poisons, carefully guarded secrets passed down through generations. Crushed herbs, deadly roots, and powdered minerals that worked slowly, ensuring that the rats wouldn't immediately associate the poisoned food with sudden death. Their exchange was brief. A few words about the weather, the wind direction, and any suspicious hearths. Then one descended, stiff and half-frozen, while the other took his place among the clouds, inheriting both the view and the heavy burden of protecting an entire city from burning down. To live in a medieval city was to live with fire and the constant fear of it. Every home had a hearth, every workshop had a forge, and every night the streets glowed softly from the candles burning behind closed shutters. People needed fire to live, but fire had no regard for boundaries. It spread from roof to roof faster than a man could run, consuming beams, cloth, and human flesh alike. The fire watcher knew this better than anyone else. His eyes never rested because the enemy never slept. The threat was everywhere. Bakers started their work before dawn, their ovens blazing. Blacksmiths hammered iron well into the night. Taverns lit torches that flickered violently in the wind. Even the churches were not immune. Their tall wooden spires made perfect kindling. Cities like London, Lubeck, and Bruges burned repeatedly throughout the centuries. Each time, they were rebuilt with the same flammable materials and blind optimism, and each time the fire watchers stood helpless, as the wind carried the inferno faster than bells could ring. They developed a sixth sense for impending disaster, a wisp of smoke that lingered too long, the sharp smell of pitch carried on the breeze, the faint orange glow against the night sky that didn't originate from a hearth. One shout from the tower, one frantic ringing of the bell, and the city would erupt into chaos. People rushing with buckets, monks chanting prayers, guards shouting orders that were never followed. For the watchman, failure was not an option. If he saw the smoke too late, he might not even survive the morning. Townsfolk, consumed by rage and grief, often blamed the fire watcher for their losses. Where were your eyes? Most of them owed significant debts to their employers for clothing, rent, or fines, a clever and devious way to keep them working, no matter how tired or sick they inevitably became. Still, money flowed like a mighty river through the red light streets, and no one wanted to dam it up. The district funded far more than just fleeting pleasure, paid for Dodge's very expansion. New buildings were constructed, roads were paved, and even law enforcement itself was funded by it. The very same men who outwardly condemned vice in the bright light of day turned a convenient blind eye at night, knowing exactly where their hefty salaries came from. And so the cycle continued. Whiskey, music, and flesh feeding the city that so often pretended to despise them. Dodge's moral compass might have spun wildly, but its economy never lost its true direction. Pointed straight towards sin, and business was undeniably good. In Dodge City, the line between law and lawlessness was thinner than a lady's stocking. The same men who tamed wild gunfights on Front Street often spent their evenings in the company of the very women they were supposed to keep in check. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Charlie Bassett, names now forever etched in legend, all patrolled the very same streets where the red lamps burned brightest. They knew that lasting peace in Dodge didn't come from shutting the district down entirely. It came from simply keeping it under a manageable level of control. The brothels operated under a silent, unspoken understanding. Pay your fees promptly. Keep your girls from starting too much trouble. And the law would conveniently look the other way. Some madams even hired off-duty deputies as guards, ensuring both protection and cooperation. The arrangement suited just about everyone involved. The lawmen got their fill of drink and comfort. The city got its much-needed revenue, and the women got just enough safety to survive another night. We remove every trace of phosphorus because it interferes with uniform strength during machining, which is great for manufacturing, but terrible for longevity. We've essentially engineered rust back into our metal in the name of progress. The Vikings and other northern Europeans were especially blessed. Their local ores were naturally high in phosphorus and low in sulfur, an ideal cocktail for indestructible iron. Archaeologists have dug up Viking nails that still gleam faintly after 1,000 years underground. Meanwhile, your garden spade looks like it fought at the Battle of Hastings and lost. So yes, medieval iron survived because it wasn't perfect. It was fortified by accident. Phosphorus turned impurities into protection, a divine chemistry trick that no one understood, but everyone benefited from. They didn't have science. They had luck, patience, and a touch of swamp magic. And somehow it worked better than ours. If medieval Europe's ironwork was impressive, India's ancient metallurgy basically rolled up its sleeves and said, "Hold my crucible." Long before Gothic cathedrals or Viking swords, Indian blacksmiths had already achieved something that still confuses modern engineers. A piece of iron that refuses to rust for over 1,600 years. It's called the Delhi Iron Pillar, and it's one of history's most polite middle fingers to corrosion. Erected sometime around the 4th or 5th century CE, this 7-meter-tall monument has stood through monsoons, humidity, pollution, and human curiosity, and it's still shiny. Tourists line up to touch it for good luck, unaware they're petting one of the most advanced pieces of pre-industrial technology ever forged. The secret? You guessed it. Phosphorus, charcoal, and slow, deliberate craftsmanship. The iron used for the pillar was smelted in small furnaces, then painstakingly welded together layer by layer. He didn't wear gleaming armor, or any armor at all. For that matter, only layer upon layer of tattered wool clothing, stiff with ingrained filth and the indelible stains of his grim trade. His boots, assuming he even owned a pair, were perpetually caked in the ubiquitous mud and the unnamable awful things that lurked in the streets. The unmistakable stench of his work clung to him like an inescapable curse, a potent cocktail of death, lingering smoke, and the faintly sour scent of rendered rat fat. When he passed by, people would instinctively cross themselves or pull their cloaks tighter around them, not necessarily out of pure hatred or disdain, but more out of a deeply ingrained sense of superstition. Rats, those relentless scavengers, didn't fear much in this world, but they certainly feared him. He possessed an intimate knowledge of their habits, where they tended to nest, the hidden pathways they favored, and what delicacies they craved most. He could hear them even when others couldn't, that faint, insidious scratching beneath the floorboards that presaged impending disease. He followed that telltale sound like a seasoned bloodhound, crouching silently in the shadows before striking with unnerving precision. One swift crack of his heavy stick, one convulsive twitch of a furry body, and a dozen other rats would scatter frantically back into the enveloping darkness. Yet the rat catcher's life was a constant gamble, a high-stakes roll of the dice with death lurking around every corner. One tiny nick from a flea-infested carcass could mean a swift and agonizing death within a week. His chosen profession carried no honor, offered no tangible protection, and certainly no reward that was remotely worth dying for. But sheer hunger, that primal motivator, had a way of making a man resourceful and inventive. The towns desperately needed his services, even if they stubbornly pretended otherwise. The local church often frowned upon such potentially dangerous craft, labeling it as witches' work and threatening dire consequences. But no priest ever seemed particularly eager to lend a hand when the rats inevitably overran a town's primary granary. In some particularly desperate towns, the most cunning catchers even turned to music as a tool in their relentless war against vermin. They'd whistle or hum softly as they worked, firmly believing that the subtle vibrations somehow unsettled the elusive creatures, disrupting their senses and making them easier to trap. Others carried elaborate charms or proudly wore talismans meticulously carved from rat bones, convinced that these mystical objects somehow kept them safe from the deadly diseases carried by their prey. Whether it was pure superstition or simply a series of remarkable coincidences, every seasoned catcher invariably had his own deeply ingrained rituals that he meticulously performed before embarking on each dangerous hunt. He might deliberately spit 3 times before cautiously lighting his smoke pot, or diligently cross himself twice upon first entering a dark and potentially dangerous cellar. The delicate line between unwavering faith and ingrained habit blurred almost imperceptibly when your very life depended on a delicate balance of skill and pure, dumb luck. And yet, despite the overwhelming filth and the ever-present danger, some men even managed to find a small measure of quiet pride in their often despised craft. They'd proudly display their recent kills in the town square, arranging rows of limp tails, neatly nailed to a wooden post like macabre hunting trophies. The gathered crowd would invariably grimace at the gruesome sight, but would still cautiously gather to carefully count the dead rats, secretly grateful that someone was diligently fighting the unseen war that raged constantly beneath their feet. They would demand as the ashes cooled. Some were beaten. A few were even executed for negligence. Watching wasn't just a duty, it was a matter of survival. So every night they climbed higher, hearts pounding, whispering desperate prayers to saints who had likely grown tired of hearing them. Lightning storms were the absolute worst. A single strike on a thatched roof could undo months of careful vigilance. When thunder rolled, they braced themselves for screams. From their lonely towers, they didn't see the beauty of the medieval city, but its inherent fragility. A world always on the brink of utter destruction. And when the pale light of dawn returned, it was a victory simply to see the rooftops still standing. When fire finally struck, it never came quietly. It roared. The moment a fire watcher spotted smoke, the calm guardian transformed into panic personified. His first reaction was purely instinctual. Grab the bell rope and pull with all his might. The sound ripped through the silence, booming across rooftops, echoing down the narrow alleys, and shaking half the city awake. 1 ring meant danger, 2 meant disaster. And when the bells rang continuously, everyone knew that the city was burning. The reaction below was instant chaos. Households sprang into action. Men grabbed buckets, women carried children, apprentices rushed towards wells or rivers. Fire carts didn't yet exist, so people formed human chains, passing water from hand to hand, most of which spilled before it reached the flames. Guards tried to maintain order, shouting over the crackling and roaring of the fire, but fear moved faster than logic. For the fire watcher, the bell was just the beginning. He had to stay in the tower even as the wind shifted and smoke rose to choke him. From above, he became the city's desperate guide, ringing the bell in a steady rhythm to direct the bucket lines. Faster for north, slower for south. In the darkness, the people listened, trusting in his unseen eyes. But things could turn ugly extremely fast. Cowboys drunk on whiskey and pride often challenged the established rules, picking fights with the gamblers or, even worse, with the women themselves. That's when the peacekeepers truly earned their pay. A single, well-aimed pistol shot could end a brawl in mere seconds. The sharp echo bouncing off the saloon walls while the piano player kept right on playing, pretending not to notice a single thing. For all of their stern talk about maintaining order, even the lawmen weren't completely immune to the charms of the district. Many formed genuine relationships with the soiled doves, brief, passionate affairs that blurred the already hazy line between duty and desire. Wyatt Earp himself was known to keep company with women of the trade, a fact that didn't tarnish his carefully constructed legend nearly as much as his many enemies had hoped. In Dodge, everyone understood that morals were remarkably flexible when the whiskey was good and the company was even better. The women, too, quickly learned how to navigate the delicate balance of power. A kind word spoken to the right sheriff could make a hefty fine disappear in an instant. A favor granted to a deputy could keep a particularly rowdy cowboy out of her room for the evening. They wielded their substantial influence not with guns, but with their considerable wit, and it often proved far deadlier. In the end, raw lore and untamed lust were willing partners in Dodge's complicated dance. The marshals may have worn the shiny badges, but when the lanterns glowed a suggestive red, it was the women who truly ruled the long night. If the soiled doves were the very heartbeat of Dodge's thriving red light district, then the madams were its unyielding iron spine. They were women who had clawed their way up and out of the cramped cribs and shacks, trading their fleeting youth for hard-won power and swapping abject poverty for influence. Each hammer strike forced out slag and sealed the joints, creating a structure so dense that even air molecules struggle to find a way in. Over time, a compound called misowite formed on the surface, a mix of iron, oxygen, and phosphorus that acts like a self-healing armor. In other words, it doesn't rust because it's constantly repairing itself, like a superhero made of metal and smugness. Meanwhile, our modern skyscrapers are built with alloys so pure they practically disintegrate on contact with humidity. The deli pillar doesn't even have paint. It doesn't need it. It just sits there, unbothered, watching the centuries pass while nearby car bumpers dissolve within a decade. What's truly poetic is that no one in ancient India knew the chemistry behind it. There was no equation, no scientific theory, just generations of trial, error, and intuition. These smiths weren't chasing perfection. They were chasing permanence. And they caught it. The pillar isn't just metal. It's philosophy hammered into shape. Proof that patience and imperfection can outlast everything we call progress. In the modern world, we have machines that can cut metal with lasers. In the medieval world, they had men with hammers. And somehow, the results were better. Every piece of iron in the Middle Ages was shaped by hand, beaten until it begged for mercy, and then beaten some more. It was a relationship built entirely on fire, noise, and questionable workplace safety. Forging was part engineering, part exorcism. The blacksmith would take a bloom, that lumpy, slag-filled chunk of half-cooked metal, heat it until it glowed orange, and then start hammering it into submission. Every strike expelled impurities, condensed the grain, and redistributed the carbon unevenly. To a modern metallurgist, that sounds sloppy. To the iron, it was therapy. This relentless hammering gave medieval iron a complex internal structure, layers upon layers of slightly different composition. Each morning, when the merchants threw open their shutters and noticed that there were noticeably fewer rats brazenly scurrying about, they piously thanked God for their good fortune, but almost never acknowledged the unsung hero who was actually responsible. By midday, he'd invariably be gone again, disappearing back into the labyrinthine depths of the next quarter of the city, relentlessly chasing the incessant scratching chorus that emanated from beneath the ever-present filth, tirelessly hunting the creatures that thrived in the very places where humans had utterly failed to maintain even a semblance of cleanliness. In a world that was perpetually rotting from within, he was both a reluctant savior and a necessary scavenger. The medieval rat catcher's tools looked less like the implements of a skilled tradesman and more like the bizarre relics hoarded by a madman. His standard kit was a motley patchwork of pure necessity and utter desperation. A tattered sack filled with a macabre assortment of crude traps, a stoppered jar containing foul-smelling bait, and that trusty, well-worn stick, polished smooth by years of relentless killing. Some catchers also carried small smoke pots fashioned from clay, filled with smoldering herbs or noxious sulfur, used to choke the vermin out of their hidden lairs. The resulting smoke was invariably thick and vile, and so, too, was the job itself. A truly effective rat catcher learned to breathe almost exclusively through his teeth, carefully avoiding inhaling through his nose whenever possible. In the rural countryside, rat catchers often favored the use of dogs wiry, half-starved terriers with battle-scarred muzzles and an insatiable appetite for their squealing prey. Others relied on ferrets, small and vicious creatures, sent slinking through barns and overflowing grain stores to flush out the vermin from their hiding places. The seasoned rat catcher knew that he'd never be honored in soaring songs or captivating stories. But when he quietly emptied his overflowing traps and grimly watched the captured vermin burn in a smoky pyre, he found a certain level of deep, internal satisfaction in the palpable silence that followed. His hard-won victory wasn't met with thunderous applause or widespread acclaim. It was the fleeting, all-too-rare sound of a quiet street, free from the constant scurrying and incessant squeaking of the relentless swarm. No matter how vitally important his hard-won skills might be to the continued survival of the community, the medieval rat catcher invariably lived his entire life as an unwelcome outsider, forever lurking on the fringes of society. The town desperately needed his unique abilities, but never truly wanted him nearby. He walked an invisible tightrope between mere survival and the ever-present stigma, grudgingly accepted only when sheer desperation forced open the city gates. Once the immediate threat from the rats had passed, so too did his fleeting welcome. Children often threw pebbles at him and cruelly called him Rat Devil behind his back. Tavern keepers made him drink alone in the darkest corner of the establishment, if they even deigned to let him inside at all. Priests invariably frowned disapprovingly when he dared to enter the hallowed walls of the local church, as though sin itself clung to the fibers of his worn coat. Even the most desperate beggars shied away from him, not out of any misplaced sense of pride, but out of sheer, unadulterated fear. The rat catcher reeked of smoke, sweat, and the pervasive stench of rot. He was a constant reminder of everything the town's more respectable folk stubbornly pretended didn't exist: the squalor, the disease, and the utter depravity that lurked just beneath the carefully constructed facade of civilized society. Still, he possessed a unique knowledge that others lacked. He could see where the fire jumped from roof to roof, where the wind was pushing sparks toward the market square or the cathedral. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the bells, steady and furious. Below, the streets glowed red, buckets splashed, beams collapsed, and people screamed names into the smoke-filled sky. Horses broke free, dogs howled, and sparks rained down from the heavens like falling stars. Sometimes the fire spread so rapidly that entire neighborhoods vanished before dawn. The watchtower itself might become a trap, imprisoning its keeper inside. Many fire watchers perished that way, refusing to abandon their post until the flames were literally licking at their feet. When dawn arrived and the smoke began to thin, all that remained was silence and ashes. Streets once bustling with merchants and laughter were now blackened skeletons of timber and stone. The air reeked of pitch and overwhelming grief. The fire watcher, if he survived, would stand over the ruins of his city, bell rope still clutched in his hand, wondering if he could have rung the bell sooner, shouted louder, seen the smoke faster. For him, every sunrise was both a victory and a source of deep guilt. When the city slept, the fire watchers truly began their work. Nighttime was the most dangerous period. When candles burned low, drunks stumbled home carrying torches, and every shuttered window concealed a potential spark. The fire watcher, perched high above it all, could see the glow of every hearth, like stars scattered across the earth. From his elevated perch, he listened intently. The faint murmur of the river, the distant rumble of carts, and occasionally that dreaded crackling sound of something burning where it shouldn't be. The shift began at sunset, 2 or 3 men might share the duty, taking turns through the long hours of the night. Behind every painted door and flickering lantern stood a woman who ran her house like a hardened general commanding her loyal troops, stern, shrewd, and utterly unflinching. Madams like Dora Hand, Nellie Bessie Earp, and Miss Kitty Loy turned their brothels into small but formidable empires. Dora, who was once a dance hall singer, became one of the most beloved women in all of Dodge, generous, elegant, and deeply respected even by the toughest and most grizzled cowboys. Kitty, who was widely known for her fiery temper and ever-present pistol, could shoot and gamble just as well as any man. She ran her parlor with delicate velvet gloves and a loaded revolver concealed beneath them. These women dealt primarily in pleasure, but they demanded unwavering respect. Their carefully chosen word carried far more weight than that of most mayors. Running a successful brothel required much more than mere charm. A madam had to carefully balance the books, keep her girls safe from harm, and maintain a fragile peace with both the often corrupt law and the holier-than-thou church. She paid the local police to quietly inspect her establishment, bribed prying reporters to keep her girls' names out of the scandalous papers, and made quiet donations to the local orphanage, an act that soothed the troubled consciences on both sides of town. Inside the bustling parlor houses, life was carefully and meticulously staged. Red velvet curtains, gleaming polished brass lamps, and perfumed air all masked the harsh reality of the trade. Talented musicians played elegant waltzes, seasoned gamblers dealt cards, and carefully manufactured laughter filled the rooms. But behind all of the manufactured glamour was sheer exhaustion. The madams kept strict schedules. The girls worked in precisely timed shifts. Earnings were meticulously split, and all debts were carefully tallied with unwavering precision. Anyone who broke even the smallest of rules faced stiff fines or immediate dismissal. Those variations became microscopic shields, each one slowing down corrosion and cracks. The result wasn't uniform, but it was durable. Like a medieval peasant, it survived through sheer stubbornness. Modern steel, in contrast, is too consistent. Machines press and roll it into perfect sheets, smooth and predictable, the metallurgical equivalent of a corporate employee who looks great on paper, but breaks under pressure. Medieval iron had character. It was dense in some spots, soft in others, and full of secrets. If it bent gracefully. When it rusted with dignity. The blacksmith's forge was more cathedral than workshop. Sparks flew like prayers. The anvil sang with every strike, and the iron literally breathed, expanding, contracting, becoming alive. Each hammer blow was a heartbeat. The smith wasn't just shaping metal. He was convincing it to exist, and maybe that's why their iron lasted. Every hinge, sword, or chain carried a little piece of its maker's madness, the kind that can't be replicated by automated rollers or quality control spreadsheets. When you hold a piece of medieval iron, you're holding something that remembers being born in fire and violence and somehow came out patient. Your modern wrench, on the other hand, was born in a factory, raised by robots, and will die of moisture exposure before the next tax season. To the medieval blacksmith, iron wasn't just a resource. It was a living thing that needed persuasion. They believed every bar had a temperament, a will, even a mood. Some iron wanted to be a sword. Some only ever agreed to be a horseshoe. You didn't just forge it, you negotiated with it. Modern engineers would call that superstition. Medieval smiths called it Tuesday. They worked with fire, not formulas. Their measurements were a handful, a while, and when it feels right. They could tell temperature by color, carbon content by the sound of a strike, and quality by how the sparks danced in the dark. But in the cramped, winding alleys of bustling cities like London or Paris, it was most often a solitary man pitted against an overwhelming swarm. Crude wooden traps with iron jaws snapped shut with brutal finality in the darkness, and the resulting sound, a sharp, metallic click followed by the frantic, high-pitched squealing of a trapped rat, was as familiar to the seasoned catcher as the resounding toll of a priest's bell at Mass. Bait was the rat catcher's most closely guarded secret, a carefully concocted mixture of dried fish, pungent cheese rind, and just about anything else that was potent enough to carry its enticing scent through the thick layers of ingrained filth. Some men swore by the irresistible allure of fresh blood, while others favored the subtle sweetness of cheap wine or the overpowering stench of rancid oil. The resulting smell could easily turn a weak stomach, but to the average rat, it was utterly irresistible. The seasoned catcher would cautiously scatter a few enticing crumbs and then sit perfectly motionless, patiently waiting in the shadows, his trusty stick poised like a knight's lance, ready to strike with deadly precision. But every tool in his arsenal seemed to carry its own unique curse. The wooden stick might unexpectedly splinter, rendering it useless. The billowing smoke from the clay pots might suddenly backfire, threatening to choke the user. The cleverly designed traps might inadvertently catch more of the catcher's fingers than they did actual rats. And then there were the fleas, always the fleas, those tiny, unseen assassins leaping from the twitching bodies of the dead rodents, carrying the deadly seeds of the dreaded Black Death. The rat catcher's hands were invariably covered in itchy bites, and his exposed skin was perpetually raw and crisscrossed with old scars. Many of them carried a lingering cough, a persistent rattle deep in their lungs that never quite seemed to go away, a grim souvenir of their hazardous trade. He knew the secret pathways beneath the city, where murky water and festering waste flowed freely. He knew whose cellars were kept spotlessly clean, whose grain was slowly rotting from neglect, and whose very homes echoed with the sound of incessant scratching within the walls. Knowledge like that invariably carried a certain degree of power, the kind that made nervous mayors whisper urgently behind closed doors, and unscrupulous merchants discreetly pay extra under the table. Some catchers skillfully wielded this subtle leverage wisely, using it to secure slightly better wages or more lenient treatment. Others devolved into petty extortionists, deliberately releasing a few recently captured rats into the homes of miserly clients to poignantly remind them of their constant need for continued service. And then, of course, there were the persistent whispers and rumors that circulated amongst the superstitious townspeople. People claimed that rat catchers secretly consorted with powerful witches, that they brewed potent potions from crushed rat bones, or that they were even capable of summoning entire swarms of vermin to curse their hapless enemies. A shrewd few deliberately leaned into these fantastic myths, donning ominous black cloaks or carrying intricately carved staffs made from blackened wood to further terrify those who dared to mock them. Fear, they quickly learned, was often as good as coin in a pinch. Despite the constant insults and the pervasive social ostracization, some townsfolk grew oddly fond of their local rat catcher. He was, after all, the courageous man who fearlessly braved the festering sewers that no one else would willingly enter, who stubbornly risked contracting the deadly plague for a handful of meager pennies, who tirelessly transformed the ubiquitous filth and disease into a fragile semblance of safety and security. They wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks to protect against the wind and frost, their lanterns carefully shaded to prevent them from blinding their eyes. On clear nights, the horizon stretched out endlessly before them, but fog and smoke often blurred everything into a gray, indistinct mess. The fire watcher had to rely on instinct, a subtle shift in the shadows, a flicker of light where there shouldn't be one. Some towers had signal fires prepared, small braziers that they could light to warn other watchtowers across the city. In places like Lübeck and Nuremberg, entire networks of towers communicated in this way, relaying the alarm faster than any human runner could. The sound of one bell would trigger another, until the whole skyline trembled with metallic terror. But between alarms, the watch was quiet, hauntingly so. The city below was still, broken only by the occasional barking of a dog or the drunken song of a reveler echoing through the alleys. Fire watchers grew accustomed to solitude. Some sang softly to stay awake. Others carved tally marks into the wooden beams to count down their shifts. Many grew superstitious, whispering prayers to saints or muttering charms to ward off the devil's flames. They saw things that others never witnessed. Meteors streaking across the night sky, thieves scaling rooftops, lovers sneaking through courtyards, and sometimes even strange lights moving beyond the city walls. But nothing frightened them as much as silence after a storm. It meant that lightning had struck somewhere unseen. They would lean over the parapet, scanning every chimney and roofline, holding their breath, waiting for the faintest wisp of smoke. For the fire watcher, night was both enemy and companion. a veil that hid danger and yet somehow made him feel more alive. Up there, with the wind howling through the ancient stones of the tower, he was the thin thread that separated peace from utter catastrophe. Still, many of the women saw the madams as their potential saviors. They offered them food, much-needed protection, and a safe place to sleep, rare luxuries for women alone in the unforgiving West. Under a madam's roof, a girl might at least live to see another year. And yet, life was undeniably fragile. A bad fire, a violent client, or one intensely jealous rival could erase everything overnight. Still, the madams stubbornly endured. They built gleaming empires from dust, carved respect from thinly veiled hypocrisy, and defiantly held their own in a world that had been primarily made for men. In Dodge City, they didn't simply sell dreams, they skillfully owned them. When the thunderous cattle drives rolled into Dodge, the thriving red light district braced itself for the coming storm. Hundreds of dusty, sunburned cowboys flooded the crowded streets, their pockets heavy with hard-earned pay and their desperate minds hungry for any form of escape. After months out on the lonely trail, eating only beans and sleeping under the cold stars, Dodge City was nothing short of heaven to them. Loud, bright, and unapologetically sinful. The men had just 3 top priorities: whiskey, women, and winning a hand of poker before the break of dawn. They came from Texas, Colorado, and the expansive Dakota Plains, boys barely out of their teens, but already hardened by countless miles of dust and death. They rode raucously into town whooping and hollering, spooking skittish horses and frightening the town's respectable folk who quickly locked their doors. By nightfall, they filled every single saloon and brothel from bustling Front Street to the very outskirts of town. The piano players never stopped playing. Neither did the relentless pouring of bottles. The cowboys quickly spent their wages, $10 at the crowded bar, $20 at the tempting card table, and whatever was left behind the curtained doors upstairs. It wasn't precision. It was intuition, a kind of spiritual metallurgy that came with burns, calluses, and a permanent cough. And yet, this philosophy worked better than most of our industrial logic today. The blacksmith's goal wasn't efficiency. It was endurance. He didn't care how fast he could make 10 nails. He cared that each one would last long enough to hold a door through 5 generations and possibly an invasion. They treated iron as if it had memory, which, chemically speaking, it sort of does. The constant reheating and hammering created grain structures that remembered their shape, making them harder to corrode or crack. Each piece was unique, a conversation between man and material. It's hard not to admire that they weren't just building. They were bonding. Every swing of the hammer was a dialogue, part punishment, part prayer. By the time a sword or gate left the forge, it wasn't just forged metal. It was tempered emotion. Today, we build things by algorithm and blueprint, perfectly measured, perfectly lifeless. If a product fails, it's within tolerance. If medieval iron failed, it was personal. A bad hinge was an insult to your ancestors. The smith didn't retire his tools when he got old. He became one with them, his hammer handle smooth where his sweat had soaked in. His anvil wore grooves from decades of blows. When he died, people said, "The forge has gone cold." Modern factories don't go cold. They just shut down for maintenance, which somehow feels less poetic and a lot less durable. Medieval blacksmiths may not have known chemistry, but they understood one universal law. If you leave iron alone for long enough, nature will eat it. So they didn't leave it alone. In fact, medieval maintenance routines bordered on obsessive. Every sword, hinge, and gate was constantly rubbed, oiled, and polished, like a beloved pet that could also kill you. Unlike us, they didn't wait until things started creaking. Still, he continued to work, day after day, because without his vital services, entire towns would inevitably starve, and deadly disease would spread unchecked throughout the population. He wasn't chasing after rats for fame, glory, or any kind of recognition. He was chasing after meager rent money, a loaf of stale bread, and a chance at mere survival. And as the distant church bells tolled ominously in the distance, he tightened the worn rope on his overflowing sack and moved wearily towards the next vermin-infested street, bracing himself to face yet another relentless swarm of teeth and disease-ridden fleas before the setting of the sun. For all of his hard-won skill and the ever-present risks he faced, the medieval rat-catcher's reward was invariably pitiful. He was an integral part of what might be euphemistically called the filth economy, those largely forgotten tradesmen who quietly kept the cities alive and functioning, all while wading knee-deep in the collective waste of humanity. The unsung nightmen emptied overflowing cesspits under the cloak of darkness. The leech collectors fearlessly trolled the mosquito-infested swamps in search of their wriggling prey. And the indefatigable rat-catcher relentlessly stalked through the darkest alleys, venturing into the very places where no one else dared to tread. Without them, rampant disease would have quickly swallowed entire towns whole. Yet they were treated as somehow unclean, grudgingly tolerated, but never truly respected. Payment was rarely rendered in gleaming coins alone. A wealthy merchant might casually toss him a stale loaf of bread or a watered-down mug of ale for a long day's worth of thankless work. Sometimes, a desperate housewife would quietly pay him in scraps of leftover food or cast-off clothing. Anything to keep the unsettling scratching noises coming from within her walls from growing any louder. When the dreaded plague inevitably returned, or a devastating famine cruelly struck, they invariably sought him out once again, desperately begging for his much-needed help. The same man-they'd. Medieval cities didn't just rely on hope to prevent devastating fires. They relied on fear. Laws were strict, punishments were often brutal, and the fire watchers stood at the very center of this uneasy system. City councils issued endless decrees. No open flames after curfew. No forges without constant supervision. No baking allowed at night. No candles near hay or straw. In theory, these laws made perfect sense. In practice, they made everyone incredibly anxious, especially when a single mistake could lead to public humiliation or even worse. If a blaze broke out, the fire watcher's primary duty was to identify where it started. Once the flames were under control, if they ever were, officials would interrogate the residents of that particular home. Bakers, candlemakers, and blacksmiths were often the first suspects. Many were slapped with hefty fines, some were imprisoned, and a few unlucky souls were even executed if the fire resulted in deaths. Even a child who accidentally knocked over a candle could bring ruin upon an entire family. The watchers themselves were held to impossible standards. Missing a fire or ringing the alarm too late could result in dismissal, public flogging, or even worse. Some were accused of sleeping on duty, the most unforgivable sin imaginable. In certain towns, a negligent watchman would be forced to stand in public next to the ruins, a bell hanging around his neck, while townsfolk cursed at him and splattered him with refuse. It was justice through humiliation, a stark warning to the next man who dared to close his eyes. Cities also employed fire wardens who patrolled the streets after dark, inspecting chimneys and enforcing curfews. The fire watchers coordinated with them from above, shouting warnings or tossing small stones to get their attention when smoke rose where it shouldn't. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance between vigilance and paranoia, the city's immune system against its own inevitable carelessness. The alluring soil doves waited patiently by the stairways in their finest satin dresses and feathered hair, greeting them all with practiced smiles and soft, suggestive laughter. For a few brief hours, these weary men could finally forget the crushing loneliness of the plains, the freshly dug graves of their fallen friends, the endless, deafening silence, and the ever-present scent of cattle and sweat. Here there was perfume, genuine warmth, and the comforting illusion of real affection. The nights were typically loud and often quite violent. Fights inevitably erupted over contested cards, desired women, or simply spilled whiskey. Pistols flashed dangerously, chairs splintered and broke, and the few lawmen waited in swinging their batons. But for most of them, it was just a much-needed ritual, a well-deserved release after months of strict discipline out on the harsh trail. The very next morning, they'd likely be broke, hung over, and half in love with a woman whose name they'd already completely forgotten. Yet the rough cowboys and the weary soil doves shared an unspoken bond. Both lived brutally hard, desperately short lives shaped by the frontier's unforgiving brutality. They understood the pain of profound loss, the necessity of great endurance, and the urgent need to live as fast as possible before fate inevitably caught up with them. When a cowboy died in a senseless barroom brawl or a tragic stampede, the women mourned him quietly. Some even silently followed the somber funeral processions to Boot Hill, standing apart, veiled as the loose dirt fell onto the rough-hewn coffin. By the time the next rowdy herd came thundering through, the vicious cycle would begin all over again. The same well-worn songs, the same familiar faces, the same gnawing hunger. Dodge City lived and breathed through those long nights. They cleaned their iron the way monks copied scripture daily, reverently, and with quiet fear of eternal damnation if they messed up. Knights kept their armor spotless, not because of fashion, but because rust was armor's version of leprosy. A single orange spot meant shame, ridicule, and possibly tetanus. To fight it, they used tallow, beeswax, linseed oil, and occasionally animal fat from last night's dinner. Picture this: a fully armored knight standing by the fire, rubbing pork grease into his breastplate while debating theology. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The fat sealed out moisture, the soot added protection, and the smell kept most peasants at a respectful distance. For larger structures, gates, fences, and church hardware, blacksmiths used tar and pitch. These sticky black coatings weren't just waterproof. They were nearly indestructible. Some cathedral hinges still bear traces of them today, like ancient fingerprints of paranoia. Modern people, meanwhile, treat rust as an aesthetic problem. It gives it character, they say, as their garden furniture crumbles into iron flakes. Medieval people didn't romanticize decay. They declared war on it. They also had a cultural advantage. They didn't own 200 disposable things made of cheap steel. They had one sword, one plow, one cauldron, and they maintained them like family heirlooms. In an era when everything you owned could be melted down and reused, maintenance wasn't optional. It was moral. A rusted sword was an insult to its maker. A rusty gate was an offense to God's craftsmanship. They didn't just preserve metal. They preserved meaning. So, the next time you see a medieval artifact in a museum, remember it's not just there because it was well made. It's there because someone 800 years ago took the time to rub sheep fat on it every week, like their soul depended on it. And in a way, it probably did. If modern steel has one great flaw, it's that it was designed by people in a hurry. On particularly good weeks, he might manage to earn just enough to buy a coveted place at a table in the local tavern, sitting alone in the shadows while the other patrons deliberately sat just far enough away to avoid catching the lingering scent of smoke, death, and decaying rat carcasses that perpetually clung to his calloused hands. Still, where there was constant filth, there was also opportunity, especially in times of widespread pestilence. In the plague years, the desperate demand for his unglamorous services skyrocketed. Fear made people surprisingly generous, at least temporarily. For a brief time, they'd be willing to pay almost anything to have their homes cleansed of the vermin, though the cleansing itself often amounted to little more than the hasty burning of a few visible nests and a mumbled prayer to Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims. But fear had its limits. The laws were written by nobles who lived in stone mansions, not rickety wooden houses. The poor couldn't afford safer building materials or separate hearths, so they faced the constant risk of fire every night. The fire watcher understood this better than anyone. He witnessed the same slums burn down time and time again, the same families losing everything they owned, while city officials blamed it all on sinful negligence. To the city fathers, fire was seen as a moral failing. To the fire watcher, it was simply reality, the price of warmth in a world built entirely out of materials that burned easily. When the bells rang and the sky turned red, there were no engines, hoses, or uniforms, just people. Medieval firefighters weren't professionals. They were whoever could be roused in time. The fire watcher's alarm was their battle cry. Bakers, blacksmiths, monks, and guards would drop everything to join the fight. Armed with nothing more than leather buckets, wet blankets, and sheer courage, every city had its own rudimentary fire plan. Wells and water barrels were strategically placed throughout the streets, and men formed chains, passing buckets from hand to hand in a frantic rhythm. The water rarely reached its intended target intact. Most of it spilled onto the cobblestones or into open mouths, as people gasped for air. Others used sand or vinegar, anything that might help smother the flames. Hooks and long poles were used to tear down burning roofs, sacrificing some houses to save the entire block. It was controlled chaos disguised as coordinated effort. The fire watcher remained above the inferno, still ringing the bell, shouting directions to those below. He was their eyes in the smoke, calling out which streets were burning the worst or where the fire had jumped the river. Sometimes his voice was lost in the roar, and the people worked on instinct alone, fighting not to save the city, but their own lives. Its vital pulse measured not in rigid law or strict order, but in the joyful laughter of the carefree cowboys, and the alluring sighs of the eager women waiting suggestively upstairs. Dodge City's red light district undeniably thrived on pleasure, but it was primarily built on constant danger. Behind every curtain of manufactured laughter and hazy whiskey smoke lurked the ever-present threat of sudden violence, quick, brutal, and often utterly senseless. Fights were as common as friendly flirtations. A wrong glance, a crooked card, or a jealous outburst could instantly turn a bustling parlor into a chaotic battleground. For the worn women of the district, every single smile carried a significant risk. Every single night was a desperate calculation for survival. The crowded saloons were dangerous pressure cookers of fragile egos and potent liquor. Cowboys swaggered confidently and armed to the teeth. Gamblers carried sharp hidden blades, and the few lawmen walked a dangerously fine line between keeping the peace and completely losing their own volatile patience. The women knew the drill well. Distract, diffuse, or quietly disappear. A gentle hand placed reassuringly on an arm might calm a belligerent drunk far faster than any drawn pistol. Still, when all else failed, knives were drawn quickly, and tempers flared even quicker. Some of the worst instances of violence came not from menacing strangers, but from those that the women trusted the most, opportunistic pimps, jealous lovers, and even other jaded madams. Rival houses sometimes fought dirty over precious territory, sending hired thugs to slash vital lanterns, cruelly cut supply lines, or deliberately scare off potential clients. The sheriff's office typically tried its best to keep some semblance of order, but all too often justice was conveniently bought with ample whiskey or lucrative favors. The women quickly learned to fend for themselves whenever possible. Everything about our metal screams, "We have a deadline." Medieval iron, on the other hand, was the slowest thing ever made that wasn't a cathedral. It took days to smelt, hours to hammer, and entire seasons to finish a gate. Iron back then wasn't just a material. It was a time investment that could ruin your sleep schedule and save your soul. The bloomer, that ancient furnace of chaos, didn't rush. It burned slowly, unevenly, and inefficiently, just the way the metal liked it. Each batch had its own personality, depending on the ore, the charcoal, and how many bad decisions the apprentice made that day. If modern production is a sprint, medieval ironwork was a pilgrimage. And that's the thing. Time changed the iron. The longer it sat in the forge, the more the impurities mixed and the carbon seeped in. Each reheating, each hammer strike aged the metal into stability. It wasn't chemistry as much as patience disguised as physics. Today, steel is made in minutes. Factories melt, refine, and roll it in one continuous process, perfect for mass production, terrible for endurance. It's like comparing a home-cooked stew to instant noodles. One nourishes you for a lifetime. The other dissolves before you're halfway done eating. Medieval blacksmiths also let their iron rest. Literally, after forging, the metal would cool in the air, a polite way of saying, "We're tired and it's dark," but that cooling allowed the structure to settle naturally, forming grains and stress patterns that gave the metal flexibility. When a sword hit armor, it bent instead of shattering. When a gate weathered a storm, it flexed instead of cracking. They didn't have thermometers or metallurgical microscopes, but they understood rhythm, the tempo of iron. You worked with it, not against it. Our modern age loves shortcuts, faster production, thinner coatings, cheaper alloys. But every shortcut comes with a timer. The medieval blacksmith didn't build for speed. He built for eternity. There were no rewards for bravery, only scars. Men collapsed from smoke inhalation, women fainted from exhaustion, and entire families worked tirelessly to save their homes. Priests walked among them, holding up crosses against the flames, sprinkling holy water that hissed uselessly on the burning coals. It was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one, a war between light and darkness, sin and survival. When the fire finally died out, the survivors sat amidst the wreckage, faces blackened with soot, hands blistered and raw. The fire watcher descended from his tower, eyes red, lungs aching, too exhausted to speak. He would silently walk through the ruins, counting the cost of what he had witnessed from above. Streets where children had played just that morning were now reduced to gray dust. No medals awaited them. No songs were sung in their honor. By dawn, they would begin the arduous task of rebuilding, using the same flammable timber and straw, knowing that another fire would inevitably come someday. But when it did, the bells would ring again, and the flesh and blood firefighters would rise from the ashes once more. To be a fire watcher was to live a half-life, always awake, always waiting, never truly at peace. The city below might celebrate festivals, hold bustling markets, and sing joyful songs, but high above it all, the watcher remained apart. His world consisted of wind and stone, smoke and silence. Even when no fire burned, he carried the memory of flames in his mind. The searing heat, the echoing screams, the acrid smell that never truly faded away. The job demanded immense endurance. Nights on the tower were freezing cold in winter and sweltering hot in summer. Rain soaked through cloaks, wind howled through the cracks in the stones, and frost turned ropes as stiff as bone. Sleep came in stolen minutes, and meals were often just cold bread eaten with numb fingers. Many kept loaded pistols concealed under their pillows or razor-sharp knives hidden in their garters. Disease added yet another terrifying layer of constant fear. The bustling brothels carried the unspoken plague of the untamed frontier, ravaging syphilis, debilitating consumption, and the slow, wasting illnesses that frontier medicine simply couldn't cure. The town's few doctors made a substantial amount of money treating the women, though they rarely treated them with even a modicum of kindness or respect. Holier-than-thou churchmen preached repentance, but very few offered any tangible charity. The women typically turned instead to each other, forming tight circles of unshakable loyalty and swift vengeance. When one girl was hurt, the others remembered it vividly, and revenge in Dodge was never slow in coming. The local fire patrols and the marshals treated the thriving district as both a necessary evil and a constant nuisance. They knew that they simply couldn't close it down for good. The money was just far too good, but they kept a vigilant eye on it at all times. Patrols walked the dimly lit alleys with flickering lanterns, always ready for trouble to erupt. Fights were swiftly broken up whenever possible. Lifeless corpses were unceremoniously dragged to the undertakers. And by the break of dawn, the muddy streets were thoroughly scrubbed. The spilled blood was carefully washed away. By sunrise, Dodge looked deceptively peaceful once again. The lamps were extinguished, the colorful curtains were tightly drawn, and the city's respectable citizens stirred about as if absolutely nothing had happened. But beneath that paper-thin layer of manufactured civility, the smoldering embers of ever-present sin and potential violence still smoldered, simply waiting for the cover of night to wake them once again. So yes, your shovel rusts in 2 years because it was born in a world that no longer believes in time. Their iron survived centuries because it was forged in one that did. By the time the Industrial Revolution rolled in, humanity decided that handcraft was overrated. The age of soot, steam, and spreadsheets had arrived, and with it, the slow death of indestructible iron. What had once been a sacred act of forging became a factory process powered by profit margins, not hammers. The result? Faster, cheaper, shinier metal that rusts like wet bread. Factories replaced blacksmiths, and the blast furnace replaced the bloomer. Could burn hotter, melt faster, and refine iron to near purity, which sounds like a good thing until you realize that pure iron rusts faster than a moral politician. By purging out the phosphorus, slag, and carbon that medieval smiths had accidentally left in, we also purged out the very chemistry that made their iron last for centuries. In the old days, every bar of metal had character streaks, layers, imperfections that protected it. Now, industrial steel came out identical, predictable, and depressingly mortal. It was the metallurgical equivalent of processed cheese. Smooth, cheap, and guaranteed to go bad faster than you expected. The New World didn't have time to care. Steam engines, ships, and railways demanded tons of metal, not longevity. If something broke, you didn't fix it, you replaced it. The blacksmith's art of patience was traded for production schedules and quality control charts. The forges that once glowed red with craft now glowed white-hot with deadlines. And the irony, the refined iron that fueled the Industrial Revolution literally corroded the machines that made it. Railway bridges had to be repainted constantly. Ships rusted faster than they sailed. Factories built to last a century were crumbling before the ink dried on their blueprints. The age of progress had officially declared war on itself, and nature was winning. Many watchers fell ill from the constant exposure. Lungs burned by smoke, joints twisted by damp air, eyes strained from endless squinting into the horizon. Few lived to a ripe old age, and yet they persevered, partly out of duty, partly out of sheer necessity. Most were poor men hired for meager pay because no one else wanted the thankless post. But there was a sense of pride in it as well, a grim satisfaction in knowing that their vigilance kept the city alive. The people below might never thank them, but they relied on them completely. Each safe night was a silent victory. Still, the loneliness gnawed at them. Fire watchers were often viewed as strange and eccentric, marked by their solitude. Some turned to drink to numb the pain, others sought solace in prayer. A few spoke of seeing things that weren't there. Phantom fires, ghostly figures walking on rooftops, the faces of those they had failed to save flickering in the smoke. It was an occupation haunted by its very purpose. The irony was not lost on them. They were the guardians of life, yet they lived as if they were already forgotten. Their towers became tombs of vigilance, their names unrecorded and lost to time. When one died, another simply took his place. No ceremony, no farewell, just another man climbing the same worn steps, gripping the same worn rope, staring into the same endless sky. And still they watched, because the moment they stopped, the city would fall asleep. And to fall asleep in a wooden city was an extremely dangerous thing to do. For the fire watcher knew what others refused to admit. That civilization was always just one careless flame away from complete oblivion. When the worst had passed and the smoke thinned into the morning mist, the fire watcher would descend from his tower like a ghost returning to earth. The streets below, once alive with laughter and trade, were now graveyards of blackened timber and smoldering stone. The blacksmiths of the past had made metal that grew old with dignity. The factories of the future made metal that died young and shiny. Efficiency ended up becoming the mortal enemy of durability. So, while the Industrial Revolution blessed us with trains, skyscrapers, and a puffed-up sense of self-importance, it also inadvertently laid the groundwork for why every car needs a tetanus shot after enduring just 3 winters. The medieval world might have been a grimy, slow-paced affair, but at least their iron wasn't perpetually begging for rust-proof paint. It turns out progress sometimes boils down to mastering the art of stylish decay. Modern science absolutely loathes inconsistency. If 2 things don't pan out with laser-like precision, somebody's head is gonna roll. But medieval iron positively thrived on inconsistency. It was born in the heart of chaos, forged purely by instinct, and cobbled together from 1,000 little imperfections that somehow managed to get along. Each and every bar of metal was a snowflake, totally unique, unpredictable, and gloriously unreliable. And that's precisely what gave it its staying power. When a medieval blacksmith wrestled a bloom from the white-hot belly of the furnace, it wasn't some pristine, picture-perfect specimen. It was more like a tangled-up hairball of slag veins, carbon spots, and silica pockets, a geological smoothie, if you will. As he hammered it into shape, those inherent flaws didn't magically vanish. They just sort of rearranged themselves. The metal morphed into a mosaic of microstructures, each with its own personality. Hard as nails in one spot, soft as butter in another. Dense over here, porous over there. By all rights, it shouldn't have worked at all, but hey, nature has a soft spot for the wonderfully weird. Modern steel, on the flip side, is the overachiever of the periodic table. Pure, uniform, and about as emotionally resilient as a wet paper bag. The air hung heavy with a peculiar silence, the unnatural stillness that always follows a major disaster, when even the birds seem afraid to sing. He would walk through what was left, his boots crunching on ashes and broken glass. Children clung tightly to their mothers, staring wide-eyed at the ruins that had once been their homes. Bakers wept over their scorched ovens. Merchants sifted through charred coins that no longer gleamed. The fire watcher said very little. His throat burned from shouting, his eyes from smoke. People would look at him with a mixture of awe and accusation. The man who saw it first, the one who rang the bell, but not soon enough. It was never soon enough. In many cities, the day after a major fire began with prayer. Church bells tolled, not for alarm, but for mourning. Priests led solemn processions through the ravaged streets, sprinkling holy water on the ashes, as if to baptize them into the afterlife. It rusts with unnerving uniformity, cracks with surgical precision, and throws in the towel exactly when the engineers predict it will. It's a dream come true for construction projects, but a total nightmare if you're shooting for immortality. Medieval iron didn't give up the ghost gracefully. It stubbornly hobbled along for centuries, thumbing its nose at logic, science, and the fine print on your car's warranty. Those microscopic impurities, the slag, the carbon, the phosphorus, acted like a built-in defense system. If rust started sneaking in, it would eventually slam headfirst into one of those barriers and grind to a halt. Corrosion slowed to a crawl, then flat out stalled. The iron wasn't resisting decay, it was redirecting it. It made peace with oxidation, like some grizzled old knight who'd learned how to roll with the punches. Even the color of medieval iron had a story to tell. It wasn't shiny or monotonously uniform. It possessed depth, dark streaks hinting at its fiery origins, a subtle gloss, a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. It looked alive, almost breathing. Modern metal, in stark contrast, gleams like a mirror right up until the moment it starts peeling like a bad sunburn.